All right. So welcome to today's webinar, The Methane Impact of Food Loss and Waste in the United States. This webinar is presented in collaboration with our partners, the Global Methane Hub, who supported this work. So we'll hear from Carolina in just a moment. Thank you so much for joining us today. And for those of you who also attended the US Food Waste Pact Town Hall yesterday, welcome back. We're grateful for your active participation in all of our programming. My name is Dana Gunders. I'm the president of ReFed. And for those of you not familiar with ReFed, we are a US-based nonprofit working to catalyze the food system toward evidence-based action to stop wasting food. We really like to focus on where the evidence leads us. And the goal of our work is really to increase the adoption of food waste solutions. One way that we do that is through events and webinars like this, which can help share information and hopefully allow you all to be more actionable in the work that you're doing out there. Before we get into the conversation, I just want to share a few quick announcements. We're excited to share that we worked with the Menus of Change University Research Collaborative, otherwise known as MCURC, on a research and toolkit to help inform food waste reduction in university cafeterias and other food service locations. And it's focused on repurposing food. And that was just released today as well. So you can find more information about it at the menusofchange.org. And that is kind of an exciting look at how different chefs were able to find uses for products in the kitchen that sometimes go to waste, but really find new ways to repurpose it. Also, we are thrilled to share that the 2025 ReFed Solution Summit, Food Waste Solution Summit, will be hosted from June 23rd to 25th in Seattle. So mark your calendars. It's this past year was our biggest event ever in Baltimore, and now we're heading to the West Coast. And Seattle, is a very different place than Baltimore, but has a really vibrant urban ag tradition, rich ecosystem of native foods there, huge commitment to sustainability, and it's going to be a really great backdrop for the event. So please join us. And we will be excited to see you there. Stay tuned. We'll have registration information coming soon. All right. Well, as I mentioned, today we're excited to talk about the methane impact of food loss and waste in the US. The global community has really zeroed in on methane reduction as a key emergency brake in the fight against climate change. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, but it only persists in the atmosphere for a few years. So reducing methane emissions now will meaningfully limit global warming in the near term. Today, we'll be sharing new data quantifying the methane impact both of surplus food in the US and of corresponding solutions. And all of this analysis is captured in our new report, which is available at refed.org/methane. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce my great co-presenters today who are here to talk about this. And I'm joined by Minnie Ringland, who is ReFed's Manager for Climate and Insights. And she has been working on climate issues with our team for the last 3 years and really led this work on the methane emission factors. And I'm also joined by Carolina Urmaneta, who is the Program Director for Waste and Circular Economy at the Global Methane Hub. Carolina has more than 15 years of work experience in the development of public policy, studies, projects, and advice on climate change and sustainability. And she formerly served as the head of the Climate Change Division of the Ministry of the Environment of Chile. So kind of like the EPA of Chile. We are hugely grateful to Global Methane Hub for supporting this work and for all of the other amazing work they are doing around the world in all sorts of ways to slash methane emissions. They really have taken methane on with such laser focus. It's been incredible to watch all of the things they're doing. So I'm really excited to kick us off today that Carolina is here to provide a brief introduction to the Global Methane Hub and why they funded this work for us on the methane emission factors for food waste. So with that, I will pass it to you, Carolina.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you for the invitation and congrats, right? Because this is going to be for sure an excellent conversation. But let me, talk a little bit about the Global Methane Hub. We are the first and only globally coordinated effort to cut methane emissions. We are a philanthropic effort, so we support different organizations to develop catalytic projects to reduce methane emissions. Methane, as Dana was saying, is a particularly super pollutant that has contributed to nearly half of the warming that we have experienced today. And this is because it is 86 times more potent than CO2 in the short term. And that's why more than 150 countries signed at COP26 the Global Methane Pledge, committing to reduce at least 30% of the methane emissions by 2030 based on the 2020 levels. If we talk about sectors, because we're talking about anthropogenic methane, right? We need to consider that we have energy, agriculture, and waste. And if we talk about agriculture and waste, like food systems, we know that 60% of the methane emissions come from food production and food loss and waste. And of course, today we're going to talk about food loss and waste. And if we talk about food loss and waste, our theory of change, like the Global Methane Hub theory of change, is to support activities on data, MRV, and accountability, uh, public policy at national and subnational level, because we're talking about food loss and waste, and also finance, on how to mobilize finance for the sector, right? Today, what we're going to talk is specifically about data, MRV, and accountability, right? And if we talk about that, and if we talk about the waste sector and methane emissions, it is important to realize two big things. One is that, of course, we have the landfills, right, and the dump sites where we dispose our trash, right, with more than 50% of that being organic waste or food loss and waste. The thing there on regarding that sites, it's that you can detect methane emissions from remote sense monitoring from satellites, right? And we are getting to a new era of data, right? That it's going to be available. We are working with a lot of satellites organizations like Carbon Mapper, Methane Sat, DHG Sat, SRUN, and others. And the information is available right now. We are going to share some web links where you can see the emissions from landfills, right, and big dam sites. And we know from EPA, as you were talking also about that, Dana, that more than 60% of methane generated by landfill food waste is released to the atmosphere as fugitive emission, right? And we don't have, like, of course, we're working on that approach, right? On capturing the biogas and using that for energy generation, or at least flaring that. But what is really important, and we know that, of course, is that we need to prevent and recover the food loss and waste and avoid that to get into landfills. So when we talk about, for example, policies, we are talking a lot about that, right? Like about how we work on regulation and new commitments, ambitious commitments regarding food loss and waste. But the thing is that we don't have until now, right? Because we're working on that, good information and good data and methodologies to do the analysis on the impact of methane mitigation because of the recovery activities and prevention activities that we could do, right? So that's why we have this partnership with REFED, and we're also working with other organizations that are collaborating in this type of approach in this to develop this methodology for methane emission factors for surplus food in the US, right? We are working in other countries also, in other jurisdictions, with different partners and also with REFED in order to have good information about this. And today we're going to hear about 5 sectors and 48 food types regarding emission factors on methane and how we can use that. And why I'm saying this, because when you have methodologies and when you have the data, then you can discuss with the policymakers, for example, on how they could include, this type of action as a methane mitigation action, as a climate change mitigation action in our new commitment. And this is really important because next year, countries must present their new NDC or their new commitments regarding Paris Agreement, right? So we do have an opportunity. The opportunity is right now because countries are discussing this. And that's why we are so happy and we are really like strengthening this work with REFIT and others to analyze the food loss and waste from the consumer perspective, considering different food types. So that's the idea. That's what we are doing. We as a hub work a lot on collaboration, and we recognize that approach also with REFIT. And really happy to hear from you, Dana, and Minnie, all the results, and then to have a discussion about this. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Carolina has been such a wealth of knowledge for us in trying to really orient how this work fits with everything else that's happening around the world. And the Global Methane Hub is really doing so much to move that global space. And so we're excited to be a partner. So thank you. And let's dive into the results. Okay, so why methane? I'll just give you a little bit more background and reiterate some of the things that Carolina said about why we at REFIT wanted to undertake this project. And so the EPA has set an important baseline, right? They have done an inventory on methane where they've said landfills are 17% of all the US methane. That's the third largest source. Food is the #1 product by weight that is entering our landfills. 58%, as Carolina just said, of the methane that's coming from landfills is coming from food scraps, according to the EPA. So this is a really important area to just understand better, like what's happening, and of course, what we can do to help mitigate it. And I want to point out one thing, which is just that, well, first of all, I think we can say with high confidence that although food waste only makes up 1/4 of landfill inputs, it is causing the majority of the methane emissions, and that's why it's so important to pay attention to. But also highlight that one of the reasons for this is that the decay for food waste happens faster than for other materials. So because food degrades so quickly, most of the methane releases happen before landfills are required to be capped or have gas capture and collection systems. And so that's like a key reason. And then even when those gas capture systems are in place, there can still be leakage. So all of that kind of points to the importance of getting food out of landfills and not just relying on capping systems to kind of solve this landfill methane problem. So that's a really, that's kind of what has been driving us towards this. And also we wanted to provide information that is going to be the basis for action for all of you. And so, some of the information you'll hear today may not be a headline news story for the New York Times, but I think we're really looking at how can we provide information to the community that is already working on this that's going to help them both analyze their own solutions, do their own scenario planning, and really kind of understand the impact of different steps that you're taking on methane. So with that, I will hand it over to Minnie to share more about our approach and our findings. Minnie, over to you.
Thanks, Dana. So to develop the methane emissions factors for surplus food in the United States, we contracted Quantis, an LCA consultancy. They have deep expertise in modeling emissions from food and agriculture using a life cycle approach. So a life cycle approach means that we consider all the activities that take place between farm and fork and then beyond. So as food moves along the value chain through up to 5 potential sectors, the resources required to grow, process, distribute, and prepare food add up, along with all the associated greenhouse gas emissions. And we call this the upstream footprint. And then as part of the upstream footprint, we know that different food types can have different emissions footprints depending on the activities associated with their production, transport, and storage. And we wanted to capture a representative mix of the types of food eaten in the US So we settled on 48 distinct food items falling into the 8 categories shown here. And one particular improvement that we made on the previous model was including prepared foods that more accurately represent foods that are a mix of ingredients, such as sandwiches or salads. And then lastly, we considered 10 different destinations where surplus food can end up. These largely align with the end-of-life management pathways represented in EPA's wasted food scale shown here. So we included the disposal options of landfill, sewer, and incineration, recycling pathways of composting and anaerobic digestion. For AD, we assumed that biogas is recovered and the digestate is ultimately land applied. We included not harvested or food being left in field, and we also modeled the more preferred pathways of donation, animal feed, and industrial uses. And more detail around what activities and processes are in scope and out of scope for each destination is available in methodology documents that are now posted on our website. Now, although the focus of this project was methane emissions, I should note that the way ReFed previously reported emissions already included methane, but it was wrapped up into the standard single value of CO2 equivalents, or CO2e, which adds up emissions from the 3 big greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, using each gas's warming potential. The conventional way to report this warming potential is over a 100-year time frame. And on this time horizon, methane is about 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide is over 200 times more potent. However, methane actually breaks down in the atmosphere quite quickly, about 12 years after it's emitted. And we have a really nice graphic here from Quantis showing on the right side how a unit of methane will trap a great deal more heat than carbon dioxide for as long as it persists in the atmosphere, but then that warming effect is gone after a few years. And because of that, we're seeing a shift now towards using a 20-year global warming potential, or GWP, for methane estimates, which doesn't artificially spread out the expecting warming over 80 years past when it's no longer in the atmosphere. And it therefore shows a much higher warming potential, closer to 80 times greater than carbon dioxide. So you can see here how much larger the bubble becomes, and that we think that conveys the urgency of addressing methane in the near term. Additionally, because methane we avoid putting into the atmosphere today will result in cooling within 10 to 20 years, it's often referred to as an emergency brake strategy, as Dana called it earlier. And that's why ReFed is trying to drive methane reduction by making these emissions from food and food waste more visible. So with that little bit of background, I'm really excited to share the results of this work. Applying the methane emissions factors to ReFed's estimates of the amount of surplus food in the food system in the US reveals that methane generated throughout the life cycle of surplus food reached nearly 4 million metric tons in 2022. This represents about 14% of the country's annual methane emissions. And if we convert this to CO2 equivalents using that 20-year global warming potential, the warming expected is on par with what 70 or 75 million cars emit over the course of a year. And to put that into context, 75 million cars is about 1/4 of all registered motor vehicles in the US as of 2022. And it feels particularly important, again, to be using that 20-year GWP because the impact we estimate from these methane emissions triples compared to the standard 100-year conversion. And when we're thinking about strategies to limit global warming before mid-century, we really need to be assessing emissions impact on the relevant timescale of the next 20 to 25 years, which is when methane has that outsized impact. Now, at ReFed, we are solutions-oriented, and to understand which solutions will be most effective in reducing methane, we need to understand the largest sources of methane from surplus food. So first off, the methane emissions from producing food that is ultimately not eaten outweigh those coming from disposal, which means that it's really important to emphasize preventing food from going to waste in the first place. Food waste prevention should ultimately reduce demand and the need for overproduction, and it also keeps food out of those destinations that are contributing to downstream emissions. Looking at the sectors that are responsible for the most emissions on the right side of this slide, we can see that households are by far the largest contributor. Those familiar with our insights engine will recognize this is largely a function of the volume of surplus food coming from the residential sector. It makes up about 50% of all surplus food. And it's also due to the food types and destinations of that surplus, which I'll dig into momentarily. I should caveat that based on limited data availability, our models do not currently capture farm level surplus in food categories other than produce. So we do know that our estimate for methane emissions from farm is an underestimate at the moment. So looking at upstream methane emissions alone, we expected that the fresh meat and seafood and dairy and eggs categories would be the highest, since beef and dairy items in those categories come from cows, the primary livestock animal in this country, who produce methane through enteric fermentation in their digestive systems. The fresh meat and seafood category in particular has an outsized methane impact when you consider the relatively low volume of fresh meat and seafood surplus compared with other food types. We were a bit surprised to see prepared foods rise to the second highest upstream emissions, but that category includes many food items that have beef and dairy content, and the high methane level is also a function of the volume of prepared food surplus, which you can see on the left side of the graph here. Turning now to downstream emissions, we expected to see the majority of methane emissions coming from landfill. That's because landfill is not only the primary destination for surplus food in the US, as well as the anaerobic conditions that we know are created in landfills. What was more surprising was the outsized contribution to methane emissions from sewer. Much less food ends up going down the drain, but anaerobic conditions in sewer systems and at the wastewater treatment plant can lead to methane generation, and that made sewer the second highest destination. I should note that Qantas based their modeling of the sewer pathway on a very limited number of studies of methane generation from sewers. There's just not that many studies out there. And these often do not isolate the food specific component from other organic material in the sewage system. So further research is required to investigate that level of granularity. And we know that EPA plans to undertake some of this work in the coming year. So together, landfills and sewers receive nearly 45% of all surplus food, but contribute almost the entirety of downstream methane emissions, which means that downstream methane emissions from surplus food could be almost entirely eliminated by diverting material from those two destinations. And the last thing I'll say about this slide is you may notice that some destinations actually result in negative methane emissions. And this comes from the fact that food scraps going to destinations like animal feed and anaerobic digestion actually create products or energy sources that offset the need for natural gas. So as I mentioned, understanding the main sources of methane from surplus food helps us identify those solutions that can do the most to reduce those sources. And as I said, because there is such a large volume of surplus going to landfills and sewers, the most methane can actually be avoided by diverting scraps from those anaerobic environments and sending them to centralized composting and anaerobic digestion facilities instead. It would cost about $6 billion to scale up the required infrastructure to avoid around 800,000 metric tons of methane, which is about 2.8% of annual US methane emissions. However, preventing food from being wasted in the first place not only keeps food out of those methane generating destinations, it also reduces upstream emissions from production and supply chain activities. So while diversion solutions address the largest volume of material, prevention solutions actually offer the highest methane reduction per ton of food material diverted. So what we have shown here on the slide is that prevention solutions addressing consumer food waste, such as education campaigns, smaller portion sizes, standardizing date labels, could avoid over 400,000 metric tons of methane, and prevention solutions that improve efficiency and ingredient utilization at food businesses could avoid another 400,000 metric tons of methane. And together that represents about 3% of annual methane emissions in this country. In total, ReFed models about 42 different solutions to food waste across the prevention, rescue, and recycling action areas. And implementation of all these solutions together would avoid nearly 2 million tons of methane every year, which is about 7% of annual methane emissions across the country. And using that 20-year global warming potential, this would have the same effect on warming of taking 36 million cars off the road or taking 400 natural gas power plants offline for a full year. So with that, I would love to jump now into a demonstration of our updated insights engine tools that feature the new methane data. So since I was just talking about solutions, I'll go to our solutions database. So you can see here the full list of 42 food waste solutions, as well as about 30 that are yet to be modeled. And the sortable view, there are a lot of different impact metrics that you can look at here, but we have the total CO2 equivalence emissions that was previously available, as well as the methane view now. And similarly in the food waste monitor, which paints a picture of existing surplus in the country, we have the total CO2e footprint available as a dropdown, as well as the methane. And all of our usual views showing the breakdown between destinations, food types, and sectors are available as before. So I do want to note that in these cases, we provided methane in the units of metric tons of CH4, and that means that the user can decide whether they want to use the 20-year or 100-year global warming potential to convert to CO2 equivalents. And then lastly, I'll show the new and improved impact calculator. So for those of you not familiar with this tool, it's intended to support more specific scenario planning. So a user can select the sector from which the surplus food is being generated. Let's say I'm a grocery retailer, the relevant food type, or leave it as a standard mix of food that exists in that sector, and the units that the user measures surplus food in, if it's not short tons. And now let's say in a baseline or status quo scenario, my operation sends about 100 tons of surplus food to landfill each year. This results bar over on the right side automatically populates with the total emissions footprint, where methane is included, but it's wrapped up again in that standard 100-year global warming potential conversion. And then now in this next section, this is what's new, is we have a methane footprint call out, and we're showing you the actual metric tons of methane, and then we'll convert that to CO2 equivalents for you based on which conversion you choose over here in this dropdown. So you can see that in the 100-year conversion, this CO2e value fits kind of reasonably into this total above, but when we switch to the 20-year global warming potential, the methane impact becomes around 3 times larger. And if we want to assess the impact of implementing solutions that divert food from landfill, we can add an alternative scenario here. And let's say we're preventing 10 tons of food from going to waste. We'll donate 20, compost 30, and then the remainder will still, the remainder will still go to landfill. And you can see now that we have both scenarios shown in the results bar with the net benefit of implementing those solutions over here in the final column on the right. So for each of these tools, the solutions database and the food waste monitor as well, you can access the underlying data by clicking the download data icon up here in the top right page of this corner. And I think with that, I will turn it back over to Dana.
Thank you, Minnie. Awesome. I'm so glad we got to do that live demo. And I think I saw, for instance, a question in the chat asking how a food bank could use this to estimate the impact of their donations. So if you saw in that impact calculator, kind of go in there and pretend it was going to landfill, and then alternatively going to donations, and that'll just give you your estimated impact. I want to point out just that, we talked a lot about this 20-year versus 100-year, and the reality that I've come to understand, and Carolina may want to chime in on this in a moment as well, but is that the ship has kind of sailed for the 100-year evaluation. Like, the big systems in the world that are tracking greenhouse gases are using the 100-year time frame, and changing that in like a fundamental systematic way is going to be very, very, very difficult. And so one of the ways, and yet there's an acknowledgement that this is a short-term acting, short acting gas. And so in my observation, one of the ways that's being addressed is for people to just talk about methane separately. So not to always be like factoring it into the total greenhouse gas equivalents, but to be having targets and goals that are just about tons of methane. And it's kind of a new it's a new unit, right? Like, I don't know that any of us has a sense yet of what 400,000 tons of methane really means exactly. Like, it's not it's kind of like not natural to our thinking yet. So this is new, right? But because targets are starting to be set in terms of tons of methane, that is part of the reason we felt like it was very important to have these separate methane factors that are in tons of methane, so that those folks working on it can really understand the impact of the different solutions that they're doing. So just a little more color on that. Okay, with that, I know I'm going to anticipate a question that's going to come up, and it's certainly one that has come up for us as we saw these results, and that's around how this information compares with some of the numbers that the EPA has put out there. So I'll tell you straight up, they're pretty different. And that never feels good when you're publishing numbers, right? And I think the first thing I'll say about that is it's kind of an ode to the fact that this is part science and part art right now. And the fact that there is just no definitive source on what emission factors are, right? So you have a lot of people trying to come up with different emission factors, and they're having to make different decisions about, what are we going to assume is the gas capture rate for landfills? What are we going to assume is the decay rate? There's different studies that show different things. So which do you choose, right? And so we worked with Quantis. They looked a lot at the GREET model, which is one of the government's tools, and some of the assumptions behind that. I will also tell you that EPA themselves have two very different estimates on this. One that's in their landfill report, and then another that's in, help me, Minnie, the wasted food methodology report, I think. So I think all of that's to say is, like, nobody's wrong, nobody's exactly right. And I think the more we use slightly different ways to come up with these estimates, the more we start to hone in on what the reality is. So just to say that up front, and ours are, like, fundamentally, ours are a bit lower than what the EPA has. So that is kind of what I'll say about that. Another source that you may be familiar with is actually another project that the Global Methane Hub funded, and that's with the Global Food Banking Network, that developed a methodology to estimate the methane benefits from donating food. And that methodology is also a little bit different. We've been trying to work closely with them because they're working in this global context that where the alternative to donating food sometimes looks a little bit different than here in the US. The numbers are slightly different. And basically the Global Food Banking Network approach is more conservative because they don't assume any avoided emissions upstream. They're really just looking at what's the downstream impact of donating instead of sending it to a landfill or some of the other destinations in the countries where they're operating. Whereas for us, we are looking at both the upstream and the downstream because we think it's important to give that full picture. And it's not that they didn't think that was important. They lined up with Vera, if you're familiar with them, and the Vera methodology, which is also just trying to be conservative. So no, it's not meant to denigrate their approach at all. It's just we are trying to sort of paint the picture that, look, when you throw out a hamburger, you are throwing out the upstream emissions. Like there was all these unnecessary upstream emissions. And on top of that, there's the downstream emissions. So it's like a double whammy. And we're trying to capture that all together so that people can understand the power, especially of prevention solutions, right? In addressing this problem and preventing surplus food in the first place. So a little bit of a comparison there for you. The other thing I want to mention is about the satellite data that Carolina mentioned as well. So this is another way in that, there's an art and a science, and I think these satellites are bringing more science to the picture. All of this has happened in the last year. So it hasn't really gotten to the point where it's starting to be incorporated into some of the formulas that are used at the EPA or other places by landfills themselves and reporting their emissions. But fundamentally, what they're finding is that landfills are emitting more methane than is being calculated or reported. And so as we get more data, and we're expecting that over the next couple of years, there will be a lot more data coming from satellites, and we'll get a much more clear picture of where this is happening and some of the details, and hopefully be able to build those into the emission factors that we're using and that everyone else is using. And so just want to acknowledge that this is a very much evolving space, and it's really exciting that we are getting a better picture of it. But just so you all know, like, we're watching how it's evolving, and we'll be trying to incorporate that as possible as time goes on. In the meantime, we have these methane emission factors that are based a little bit on kind of the current formulas and life cycle assessments that are out there. So just to note that. With that, I am going to transition us over to some Q&A. And open it up to questions. Thank you to all of the partners listed here for their contributions to this work. We had a lot of people look stuff over, and then just across our networks, we've gotten a lot of feedback and support. So thank you to anyone who was part of that. And as you think about your questions, I know a few have come in, some of them very geeky, which I totally appreciate. And we'll get to them in just a second, but I do want to just kind of take it back first to Carolina, just on any reflections you have of any of this, but also as people are here to kind of understand that methane and food waste connection, anything else you can kind of tell people about things that are happening in the current landscape globally.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you, Minnie, for the great presentation. I think there are some things in the chat that are really good, and someone was saying that we should reduce methane because it is a shared climate-led pollutant. And yes, it's exactly right. And this is like pulling the emergency brake on global warming. Okay, that's what we are trying to do with methane mitigation. So this is not different on when we talk about carbon neutrality, for example, right? On net zero targets, things like that. This is part of that agenda, but if we reduce methane this decade, we do have an opportunity. So that's the thing. I think it's really important. If we talk about and I think you explained it really well, like how to use and how to engage the food loss and waste prevention and recovery agenda with the climate change agenda is what we are trying to do through these methodologies and this data, right? And what you said, Dana, it's pretty good, because when we talk, and I used to work at the government, right? So when we talk with policymakers and people that it's making decisions about what activities they are going to support with regulation, standards, etc., we need to have different approaches. So the methodology that you are presenting today considers, as you said, prevention and recovery. And we have other methodology, like the one that you were explaining with the Global Food Banking Network, which is specific for full recovery to avoid methane emissions, right? The approach is different, yes, but not 100%, right? It's just like you have like a broader approach, and that's great. And the idea is, and this is really important, right? What you have right now is for the US, and it is, of course, something that we could use in other countries, but we need to consider some things, right? Like the emissions factors from, I don't know, energy system, what is the composition of the waste, etc., etc. And that is something that we can address also with methodologies like the one you were talking about, BERRA, gold standard, and others, right? For them to replicate these type of models at the global level. So that's the idea. Of course, here we don't have one silver bullet, right? Like we need to have different approaches in order to address this. You were talking also about what's going on, right? And I think it's really like important what's going on regarding food loss and waste. This is not an issue that we are used to discuss at COPs, for example, or in climate change discussions, right? We know waste, yes, it is important. Yes, we're talking, if we talk about emissions, we're talking about food loss and waste, but we don't have a lot of action there. And last COP, COP28, we launched together with a lot of countries and organizations the Lowering Organic Waste Methane Partnership to support different countries at national and subnational level to reduce methane emission, talking about upstream, so prevention and recovery, and also downstream. And this year, what is going to happen, probably, yeah, and this is what we aim, is that COP29 presidency, they have in their action agenda a specific initiative regarding methane reduction from organic waste. This is the first time that we're going to have a declaration regarding organic waste. They were talking about waste in previous COP, yes, but organic waste, this is a huge issue, right? It is a declaration, yes. Is this going to make that everything is going to work? No, of course, right? This is a declaration. But this is to have, high-level discussions about organic waste, about food loss and waste, and about how to reduce these emissions. So that's why this is important. And this is happening, right? This is public. The declaration is not public yet, but we expect to have that in a couple of weeks, right? Because they need countries to support this initiative. And we need you, right? We need all of us to support this type of actions in order to get, high-level discussions on this issue and some action and methane mitigation. That's what we need. It is also important to consider that during the next COP, COP29, we are going to have new information regarding satellite monitoring, and that's going to be also huge if we talk about transparency, right? If we talk about economic instruments, if we talk about how to incentivize these type of things, we need to have good information and good transparency on this. And the last thing is that COP29, it's going to be, we hope to have this organic waste and methane reduction declaration. But for COP30, that's going to be in Brazil. I'm based here in Chile, so South America and Latin America. This is going to be huge for us. And we expect to have a huge mobilization regarding this agenda too, right? So we are getting there, and that's why we need this type of tools like the one that you are presenting today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carolina. And I will say to everyone, Carolina has been such a help for me to try to understand, like, what does it mean to have a big declaration on this? Like, how does this global negotiation stuff, first, how does it work? But also, what does it trickle down to eventually in terms of your work if you're, at a local government, for instance, or something like that? And I think in my translation of what I've learned, it takes a little bit of time. You start to get these declarations at this very high level, but it does force governments, when you have a declaration like that, it forces governments to first decide if they're going to sign on or not, right? And if they sign on, well, then it kind of provides a point of accountability. And if you pair that with some of the satellite data that's happening, right, that gives us the ability to sort of look and be like, hey, wait a minute, country X, you know, you said you were going to do this, but also our satellite data is showing there's a huge amount of methane coming from your landfills. So what are you doing? And so I think it's like again, a little bit art science again, in terms of kind of how that translates to really rules and changes on the ground, but it's an important context that gets set. So yeah, thank you for that, Carolina, and for all the work you're doing to make that happen, because I know it is a lot. These things don't just happen. All right, so let's turn to some of these audience questions here. And I see a few about sewer and like the wastewater treatment systems. And well, I have to say, this is an area that is very interesting and also really needs a lot more research. But I think one of the biggest ahas for me was that sewers per ton, if you look at this per ton, our emission factors for sewer is significantly higher methane emissions than for landfills. And actually, when we started this work, the numbers Qantas came back to us were even higher than that. So even when you're conservative in the way you're framing your emission factors, the wastewater treatment systems are higher emissions than landfill. And also in places like Europe, they don't even have garbage disposal. So that's what we're talking about really, right? Is like food going down a garbage disposal into the sewer system. It's not even a thing over in somewhere like Europe. I don't know, in Chile, do you guys have them? Does the food waste go into the sewer there?
No, we don't have that. No.
Yeah. So
No.
we're kind of unique in this sense here in the US. But it's really important because as more places like California have these diversion targets, it is a key solution that they're looking at. And I know California in particular has plans to really like increase the amount of what's called co-digestion, which is basically trucking food over to a wastewater treatment plant and adding it in to something that already has a digester. So I'm gonna maybe ask Minnie to get into the scientific details of this, but I think our understanding is that there are a couple reasons that sewers are so high. One is that some of them have these stabilization ponds, so they don't even capture the gas, and it's kind of just like a big pond of sewage just sitting there, kind of gross, but that leads to a lot of methane. It's very anaerobic. The other thing that can happen is that they actually do put a digester on, but that digester has leaks. It's in the flaring is not complete, and there's not like another use that it's being piped to. It's just kind of about using it right there on site, and so that can essentially basically lead to a lot of methane emissions. There's a third option, which is aerated. Those have lower emissions, but they're not capturing the gas. They're just making it not aerobic. Minnie, anything else you would add on to kind of the picture when it comes to wastewater treatment plants?
I think you mostly covered it. I'll just add that, for the sewer pathway, but also for other pathways like anaerobic digestion, where we know that there are in animal feed, where we know that there may be different practices in place across the country. We tried to model each one of those and then include that into sort of a US average scenario where we're sort of, weighting the averages of those different values based on the proportion of practices taking place across the country. So for example, for sewer, there's sort of two different sewer network systems that have different levels of methane emissions as food is moving through the pipes, and they sort of averaged those two conditions. And then, as you mentioned, the sort of three buckets of treatment types at the wastewater treatment plant were also averaged.
Yeah. And there's also a couple questions about hooking kind of that the product of anaerobic digester, the methane from some anaerobic digesters at treatment plants to the system, like kind of so that can be used. To be honest, I don't think we're totally up to speed on sewer systems and all of the details there. So I'm not sure I can answer that, whether or not there really is a lot of work going on. I haven't heard of any work to really focus on trying to capture that methane for use. All right, there's a couple of questions here on policy and kind of how this can be used in policy, if it's incentivizing or disincentivizing. I think policy in the US is really interesting because when it comes to waste, the jurisdiction for policy is state by state. So there's not a lot of federal jurisdiction for waste except for things like emissions from landfills. So a couple things to say on this. One is that we are anticipating that the EPA will soon be opening up the landfill methane regulation. So the rules around when you cap landfills and some of those details are actually, there's a plan to reopen those most likely and hopefully make some improvements on what the rules are around capping landfills. So that's something we know at the federal level. Beyond that, these kind of, can you ban food from landfills? Can you force composting infrastructure? You know, how do we do this? That really has to happen at the state level. And there are, I think we're now up to 11 states that have some kind of rule on this. Some are more effective than others. And it's certainly something that's on our radar. I think the policy side of this is really important for two reasons. One is this infrastructure is expensive, and I think it's just definitively has to be at least partially a public investment. And the second is that without rules, like it's very hard to get anywhere close to full participation in something like an organic waste ban. So that's something that I know some groups are thinking of. Certainly the Zero Food Waste Coalition that REFED is a part of is very much looking at how do we drive state level organic bans. And so if that's something you're interested in, please check out the Zero Food Waste Coalition. You can sign on as a member. And if you do so, you know, the Zero Food Waste Coalition can help you kind of get some of the tools to maybe introduce something like that in your state. All right, let's see. I am just going through this. All right, there's some geeky questions, Minnie, for you. Did you measure mixed landfill emissions for the tool, or is it homogeneous waste? In other words, household food waste is mixed or not? And I think there was another one. Well, let's start with that one.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think maybe one of the ways that our tool differs from the ways that it's been modeled in the past. So one benefit of the granularity that we have in the insights engine is that the surplus data that we have is pretty granular. So we have specific food items, and then the work that Quantis did to model these destinations for us was done at that food item level, depending on, you know, moisture content, dry matter content, energy content, things like that. And so we sort of apply those factors at the food item level and then combine them into kind of a weighted average based on the amount of surplus that exists in the system. And the idea is that more accurately reflects the mix of food that actually is going into the landfill.
Okay, got it. All right, here's a good one. I've actually been wondering this, and Carolina, I'm going to send this one to you. If the lifespan of methane is 12 years, why do a 20-year global warming potential? Why not just do a 12-year global warming potential?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And this is because we have the IPCC, right? The International Parliament of Climate Change, Scientific Climate Change, IPCC. So they have guidelines that countries and other organizations should use in order to develop inventories and things like that, right? And they have global warming potential for 20 years, 100 years, and another amount of years, right? We don't have a specific one for 12 years. They do have some studies, right? And for you to know, for example, when we started to work with inventories back to 1926, for example, we got the first guideline from the IPCC. Now we have others, of course, and the global warming potential for methane has increased. If we talk on a 100-year base, we started to work with 21. Now it is 28 in a 100-year period, right? If we talk about 20 years, it's the same, right? Because this is like something that it's the same that you were saying, Dana, before, right? A lot of investigation, a lot of research is doing on this, and the numbers are updating all the time. The thing is that we have, as like organizations and countries, we do have the guidelines from the IPCC that makes like it is mandatory for countries to use that when we present an inventory to the UNFCCC, okay? And we must use the guidelines from IPCC, and we can have, like specific emission factors at the local level, but not for the global warming potential. That is a discussion that we are not, as you were saying, Dana, I don't think we are prepared to have, right? Because if you do that, for example, and if you think, okay, we have 1 ton of CO2 and we have carbon markets, we have carbon neutrality goals, we have everything based on that on a 100-year period, right? If some countries change that, or some sectors change that to 20 years, right? Well, it is 4 times, like the methane emissions. And are you going to change that only for methane, or we want to have that discussion for other GHG gases, right? Like, so that's the problem. And of course, for methane, this is really important because it lasts 12 years in the atmosphere. But it's something for us, as you were saying, to raise awareness about methane and about the opportunity that we do have right now for this. Just one comment regarding sewer treatment plants and anaerobic digestion. In Chile and in most of the countries in the global south, we don't have food scraps in our, that's why we don't have the systems like the one that you have in some states in the United States. We just have wastewater treatment plants, okay? So that's different. And that's also an opportunity because most of the wastewater treatment plants, we do have anaerobic digestion for the sludge, right? And there you could, for example, mix some organic waste with the sludge to have anaerobic digestion. And of course, we could have some leakage, as someone was saying. And what we are supporting also is the World Biogas Association, WBA, to improve and to promote better standards on methane leakage for anaerobic digestion. So they are working on that, and probably by the end of this year, we should have, a very good standard on that. So that's something that we could also use and share soon.
Yeah, I know. There's a whole set of complexities over on that side that I think we're honestly just trying to wrap our heads around as well. So, well, super. We have a whole bunch of questions that we are not going to get to today, but I so appreciate just the incredible level of engagement. And we will, whether Minnie likes it or not, we are going to include her email in the follow-up, and so that you can send your questions to her if you want some of them answered that we didn't get to today. Again, I just want to thank both Minnie for her unbelievably hard work on this for the past year, really, is what it's taken. Carolina, for all the support you guys have given us. And everyone here, I mean, we had over 200 people today, and just know that you all who are here are people who are really going to take this and use it. And we will continue to try to be here as a resource. I've already gotten one text saying, can you present this to the legislators in our state? So love that. We definitely want to see this get out there, get into use, and are open to ideas on how we can do that, whether it's in a tool that you're creating or in other ways in your work. So thank you all so much, and onward.